first for you, anatomy or yoga?
Technically, yoga came first. If I go way back, I don't really count this typically, but it's just fun to say that my nursery school, not nursery school, but before kindergarten, my preschool teacher, she did yoga with us. I don't know how much of an impact that had on me. I mean, my recollection is doing butterfly in that case, pretty much more than anything, which is cute. But I was working in a natural food restaurant when I was in high school, and it was here that I met my Tai Chi teacher, who also introduced me to yoga. So this was 1988, so 17 years old, and doing Tai Chi, and then he introduced me to yoga, and so I took that with me to university and to school, which is harder to maintain a yoga practice while also going to college. But intermittently I did practice. And then when I left university is when I went to massage school, and where I more formally learned anatomy. Yeah.
Nice.
So yoga technically came first, but it still impacted my my understanding of anatomy, because I had some kinesthetic or felt sense experience of myself, and of course Tai Chi is super slow, so you really start feeling things, and so in a way the anatomy gave me words and names and descriptions for sensation and experience. So yeah, the yoga came first technically.
And you're practicing Ashtanga yoga. Yes.
Yes.
And what makes you gravitate towards this style of yoga?
That's a good question. I all up until I met Ashtanga, which was in either end of '98 or early '99, I was doing Shivananda, or more classical Hatha yoga, and I always laugh about it because it was so opposite of the Ashtanga method. I joke, and instead of holding the abdomen in, you let the abdomen go out when you breathe in. Instead of doing a vinyasa between postures, you lay down and take shavasana. And so it was kind of strange how it happened, but the person who introduced me to Ashtanga was a trade between me doing body work for her and her giving me a yoga private, which was the first time I had always ever just done yoga on my own, and with my Tai Chi teacher and whatever. So it had been a number of years since I'd even practiced with anybody. Yoga studios were not abounding yet. It was right at the beginning of that wave. So anyway, she introduced Ashtanga to me, and it was obviously the opposite. But it was, I think it was the breathing more than anything. There was I think at that point there was still the physical challenge was attractive. But the flowing movement of it and trying to put the breath to that, as much of that came across in the first class, just was like, what the heck is this? And then it kind of built curiosity, and it's the breath that keeps me going back to it more than anything.
So the way you teach the anatomy class, I feel like what really drew me to your teaching as an anatomy teacher was that you were an Ashtanga practitioner. And so I felt like when I watched any of your videos or read any of your articles that you really understood what me as an Ashtanga practitioner was experiencing. So when you teach anatomy, do you feel like though you're also talking to the wide variety of yoga practitioners?
I do. I think what comes out of the Ashtanga practice is that very deep familiarity with the postures. And it's a common thing I say about Ashtanga to people. It's like, the people who say, oh, it's always the same pose over and over again. And of course, there's worlds and worlds inside those postures, and there's a depth to it that you would never get to and I don't mean in terms of flexibility, but a depth of understanding the postures that you wouldn't get if you didn't do them so often, right? For so many years of exploring it. And so I think, I mean, the postures, whether they're in Ashtanga or done outside of Ashtanga, it's the same posture. And so really the doing of the postures so many times and working with these postures, I always refer to my body as a laboratory. And Ashtanga is the sort of scientific method that is applied to the library and where I mine the information out of. So I think I certainly have a bias that I come from, that I see the practice, through the eyes of Ashtanga. It's brought me that depth to be able to explain it. They can only understand it if you don't do the same posture and over again. You don't have years of experience doing it, which of course you can get outside of Ashtanga too. You may not, everything I say or present or write about might not hit, but in particular for the Ashtangis who are also having that level of familiarity with it, I think it definitely resonates with. So I think that's probably why. Although I think it's general information, it's good information for people outside of Ashtanga. The Ashtangis are really going to resonate.
Other dynamic forms of yoga.
Yeah, sure. And they're the people I like to talk to because we much more easily can have that common language around talking about postures and the experience of what they were like in the beginning and what they turn into. And because there's generally a common process that unfolds as you continue to practice. And Ashtangis kind of share that, in ways that, I'm not an Iyengar practitioner, but I would assume that the Iyengars, as they develop, also have that camaraderie around the experience that they create through the style and method of practice that they do. It's the same idea, just a different style. Yeah, so it's quite nice to hang out and talk to the Ashtangis and further embed that bias that I have towards the practice. Yeah.
And another thing I've been thinking about is, do you think there's something different between anatomical alignment within movement and yoga alignment movement? Is there something different there?
Well, there's different versions of anatomical alignment and movement. There's different schools, there's different philosophies, there's different perspectives, and the same is also true for yoga alignment, right? Not everybody agrees on what should be what way.
That's kind of what I'm wondering about. So, if we go through our Ashtanga practice, should our Ashtanga practice really reflect anatomical alignment? Like you said, when we were looking at lotus, for instance, and the external rotation of the tibia, and if you've got any issues in your knees, you might not want to be playing with that edge of, do you see what I'm meaning? So
I think there's, the anatomy can inform basic function, for sure. And I think the range that we can acceptably practice in is wider than most people think. Certainly there's a point where if you do things poorly or alignment as the word, you can run into trouble over time. I think what happens also is it that we want to create an ideal form first, or do we want to allow function of the tissues and the joints to be there first? And this is an open question. There's no real decision about that. I think in Ashtanga we have a tendency to allow the form to take shape over a longer period of time and kind of put function in. And so it's like letting a beginner be a beginner and not necessarily fixing everything. Every teacher, of course, decides how much or whatever. But I think as the body opens, it comes to take on a more idealistic form because the tissues are now open, the joints are now open to be able to be in that place. And that's kind of my default, again, until we hit some edge where obviously if you keep doing it this way, chances are you're going to run into trouble, whether it be the knee, the back, or the shoulders. You know, it's one of those three places. So I think they talk to each other. I think sometimes alignment is too much based on almost a simplified version of anatomical position and basic movements that isn't realistic. That's why you see a lot of movement-based forms moving towards these very organic movements, crawling around on your fingers and climbing, and because it takes us back to just erase all of that and put us back into a sort of more natural, organic place of using our body in a variety of different ways. Yeah. And so, you know, too much alignment can become a rigid thing, and at the same time, it can also alleviate problems. Yeah. It can do both. Yeah. It's just when, who to apply it to, at what point, and then is it open enough to allow for differences in different bodies? You know, it's one thing to have alignment that helps a person put their body into a position that feels good. It's another thing to have alignment that everybody should do for the sake of alignment. That's kind of the two ends of that spectrum, I think, that we have to be careful with because we naturally come to find that this works for us, so therefore we want to apply it to everyone.
Yeah, well, that's kind of where one of the reasons why I have that question is sometimes we think that if we find that alignment, now I'm going to be able to do the pose like so-and-so.
Yeah, that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
It's always an interesting, I mean, most of the modern alignment that everything gets judged off of is kind of Iyengar based. They were the first ones to really put in these rules and how you're supposed to put things and fix things, to have some experience. And I often say, there's no doubt in my mind that it worked for Mr. Iyengar and many of his students, but it doesn't work for everyone. And what about those people that it doesn't necessarily work for? So.
Yeah, so allowing some softness in there, some gray area.
Yeah. I mean, they always do, especially when there's injury. But what about prior to that? You know, I have seen people do alignment cues, generally accepted ones, and injure themselves as a result. It doesn't, and that still doesn't make the alignment cue wrong or bad. Applied to the wrong person, however, or at the wrong moment in their practice and development. So I find it quite complex. Yeah, and fascinating and interesting.
Exactly.
And we were talking about this at lunch. It's like the anatomy allows for that objective perspective on this. Like, can I see them as who they are, rather than who I want them to be, meaning through some form of alignment.
Also on that same subject, do you think that sometimes we're doing poses that are very anatomically unnatural?
Yes. I
And
mean,
why do you think they're there? Those
I
poses?
mean, you know, I think the asana practice is about exploring. It's about checking out yourself and looking into every nook and every cranny. I kind of said it in the workshop. It's like if you go to the doctor, and you know, because you're asking the question based on general rules of what movement should be.
Yeah.
So, well, let's have the doctors hold that line of what that's supposed to be. Actually, my neighbor across the street is an orthopedic doctor, and so we kind of go back and forth a little. Super nice guy. But if I asked him, so when I put my foot behind my head, he's going to be like, why would you ever put your foot behind your head? Or why would you ever put yourself into the shape of a deep back bend or hold on to your ankles? Or, I mean, that's not required for normal everyday activities. So then they would ask, why would you bother to do that? I think from the yoga perspective, however, it's like, it's not just can I open my body enough that I can do that posture. It's like, what is it even like to head in that direction and play with the edges of what I think is possible. I think that's what becomes more important about it. And whether you arrive or not doesn't matter. I mean, it's the journey, not the destination. Of course we say that kind of stuff all the time. But I think it's really true.
And do you think it plays something deeper than the movement in the body, but how we relate to it on an emotional level or on a mental level or spiritual level?
I think it can work through all of those levels at different times. I think, when we engage with asana themselves, at first there's the physical figuring it out. And then there's, the resting into it, and then it starts to kind of have a quality to it. That kind of settles in at a deeper level. Getting to the spiritual part, I think, is a little bit more broad than any single asana could ever sort of give.
Or a gateway.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's, the practice is also about how the asanas in particular work on our nervous system and how we can control our breath or our mind in relationship to being in this awkward position, however awkward the awkwardness gets. And I think that aspect of it is what starts to reflect back on us where there's work to do. And it's much more subtle. At first it's very physical. And some people just stay there, to be quite honest. There's still benefit going on at that level of it. But when you really start to go inside, you start to realize that there's self-reflection going on in the midst of that. Or there's a certain training to the nervous system of how to deal with being in that position. Or I think that's what becomes more important and interesting than whether you can do the pose or get out of the pose once you've gotten into it.
And walk home.
And then walk home. And David Swenson says, does it make you a better person? Or, and that's ultimately what's important anyway. But most of the work through asana practice is really how it relates back to the nervous system. And it's one of the things that I've come to discover that I really appreciate about the Ashtanga system is the breath and the movement together is potentially, it's like a double impact on the nervous system. And then once the nervous system starts to get cleaned up, this leads to us naturally doing things like pranayama, meditation, which is the whole idea, is that we clean up the nervous system to a degree where we're not constantly, like a jumpy squirrel, always going like this, and we can sit calmly and quietly and control ourselves. In a way, that's all the asana that you need. Once you get to that point, it's kind of like, the asana is not as terribly important, because you've changed. And now the next level of work comes, or the next tools present themselves so that you can work on a more subtle level. And onward it goes, I assume.
And so this would be the aging Ashtangi.
Both the aging Ashtangi and the developing Ashtangi. And hopefully it's not just on a spiritual level, that's certainly possible, but it's not guaranteed. But also on a personal level. And those two together simultaneously, very powerful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.